Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show called Consistent Preterism. My name's Jason DeCosta. I'm driving in my truck, and I just wanted to talk briefly a little bit about Daniel chapter 12. So Daniel chapter 12 is the time of the end. It's the prophecy of the end. Where Daniel sees these visions of all this wackadoodle stuff that's going on. We see that the book of Revelation, so Daniel pictures these events as being sort of not near or not yet. He's told to seal up the book and everything because the time was, still a ways off. Whereas John comes along in the end, in the last days, seeing the exact same scenario, the exact same elements of that vision in the book of Revelation just before the end. And he says he's told not to seal the book because the time was at hand. So the fulfillment of the end that Daniel predicted was now coming to pass at hand and shortly from when John wrote. And so we see some interesting things here that people just probably don't pick up on. Now, I've been telling people that the resurrection and the judgment and the promise and everything was only for Israel, right? And so the prophet Daniel actually confirms this. Now let me ask you a question. If Daniel says that the resurrection and the elements of this vision were only for his people, who do you suppose that is? Well, it's not Egyptians, I can tell you that much. It's not Assyrians. It's the Israelites. So let's just read Daniel chapter 12 very briefly here. Verse 1 says this, speaking of the time of the end, it says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people." Again, so there's the sons of your people, okay? So we automatically see that the context is limited to your people, to Daniel's people, all right? There was no such thing as a wackadoodle spiritual Israelite concept back in Daniel's time. That's ridiculous. So the your people, okay, that was relevant in Daniel's time, Daniel's people, has to be the same people who get the promise at the end. Okay? So he says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time." So this time of trouble, or this great tribulation that Daniel speaks of, we see that Jesus says that this time, and when he comes along in the Olivet Discourse, talking about the last days that they were in, and that last days generation was going to go through some severe times and tribulation and great distress upon that people. And Jesus even says it'll be a time of trouble such as never was or never will be on this nation, right? So he's basically mirroring what Daniel said about this time of the end. But notice that he says there shall be this time of trouble, Daniel predicts, right? And then Jesus comes along in Matthew 24 saying that this generation is going to experience this great tribulation. Well, remember in Revelation chapter 7, when John is looking at the completed picture of all the sealed and redeemed ones standing clothed in white before the throne, saying salvation belongs to our God? Well, just prior to that, in the beginning of Revelation 7, he hears who they were, right? He hears 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed, awaiting the day of inheritance. And then he looks, and then he sees that same multitude, but this time he describes them a little differently. He says, "I looked and saw a great multitude from all nations, tribes, tongues, and kindreds." In other words, he's telling you that the 12 tribes of Israel, those who were sealed in the last days gospel commission, were from all nations, tribes, tongues, and kindreds. And that's why the gospel had to go out to all these places. And that's why the beginning says that through Abraham, his seed would become a multitude of peoples, or many peoples or many nations would be blessed through his seed, because they were literally everywhere. And that's just a progressive sort of transition through the whole story. We see Israelites out in the nations the whole time. And of course, you know from Deuteronomy 4 that is actually predicted in the beginning that Israelites would be out in the nations, paganized, worshiping false idols, and they'd be brought back. God would remember the covenant he made with their fathers, and he would have mercy upon them in the latter days. So that's obviously fulfilling this. But what I wanted you to take note of is what Daniel and Jesus referred to as this time of great trouble or great tribulation. Because in Revelation 7, we see the great multitude from all nations, right? And then at the very end of Revelation 7, someone asks someone, where do these ones come from? And what's the answer? The answer is, these are the ones that come out from the Great Tribulation and who have washed their robes in white, in the blood of the Lamb. So, if Jesus said the Great Tribulation was going to take place in that generation, okay, the Great Tribulation, he says it, this will be the greatest tribulation on any nation, pulling from what Daniel said about the end as well, this great time of trouble. But Jesus encapsulates that great tribulation period in that last days generation. That's the whole point. It was going to end at his coming. So what does that mean then about the great multitude from all nations, tribes, tongues, and kindreds that Revelation 7 says came out from that great tribulation? Well, I think you know what it means, and I think it explains exactly why that picture in Revelation 7 was at hand and about to take place. The reason is because that great multitude from all nations, tribes, tongues, and kindreds is a fulfilled, complete picture of all the tribes of the children of Israel standing redeemed before their God from all nations, tongues, tribes, and kindreds, having been bought back to God through the blood of Christ. Standing clothed and redeemed, clothed in white, singing a new song, crying out, salvation belongs to our God. That is the victory moment. That right there is the inheritance. They're standing before the throne. I think they even have palm branches in their hands, and it's just this glorious time where they're celebrating their salvation. They've inherited their salvation. So the great multitude from all nations, tribes, tongues, and kindreds cannot extend beyond that last days generation that was going to come out from the Great Tribulation that Jesus spoke of. Any full preterist who says that that great multitude picture in Revelation 7 is not a full preterist. I'm sorry, that says that picture is future or consists of future happenings is not a full preterist. They're an inconsistent full preterist, because that picture in Revelation 7 of the great multitude has to match up with the only other time of trouble or time of great tribulation that we read of in the New Testament, which Jesus said would take place in this generation. That was part of it. That was going to lead up to and conclude at his coming. All these things will take place in this generation. Okay, so Revelation 7, great multitude, completely fulfilled by the coming of the Lord. And again, you have to ask these inconsistent full prets. They say that all the things in Revelation were at hand and about to come to pass, which they be right, but then they go ahead and say that that picture of all the ones standing redeemed from all the nations is an ongoing salvation narrative for all time, but it doesn't make sense. We are not coming out of the Great Tribulation today, folks. Okay, the only way you can put that Revelation 7 picture into our day today is to say that we have come out of the Great Tribulation. But that doesn't work, because the Great Tribulation ended when the Lord came for his bride and put all his enemies under his feet and crushed them and delivered the kingdom to the Father. All right, and then it just goes on. We'll wrap this up. It says, and at that time, your people, Daniel, shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book of life. Okay, again, your people, Daniel. Is Daniel speaking of Egyptians and Assyrians here? No. This is still your people. Everyone who is found written in the book. Okay, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So what is that representing? Again, it's representing the end of the age, where the books would be opened. Like Revelation 21 states, the books would be opened, and only those written in that book would enter into the new city. Well, that book was opened at the end of Israel's days. This is what Daniel's saying. He's saying, your people will rise, some to shame, some to life. Those of your people who are written in the book will inherit the promise, right? And he says, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So he's speaking of their heavenly angelic transformation. Luke 20, Jesus tells them that they wouldn't die anymore in the resurrection in the age to come, and they'd be like angels in heaven. Well, that's that same those who will shine. Sorry about that. Got a call. I always seem to get calls when I'm in the middle of audios. Everybody hates me. Nobody even cares about me until I'm in an audio, and then I'm like the most popular man alive. Anyhowser. So I was talking about how Daniel is talking about those who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. I believe that that's a tie-in with their heavenly body, their angelic body. That they were going to receive, that Jesus speaks of in Luke 20, that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians 15, that we see in Revelation at the end. When they receive it, they will never die. He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes. They'll put on incorruptible, blah, blah, blah. So I just see that ties in nicely. And then Daniel goes through some other stuff in chapter 12, and at the end he says to Daniel, last verse, but go your way, Daniel, until the end, for you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. So clearly at the end of this prophecy, Daniel was going to rise to his inheritance. Okay, there's a clear statement there. I know that some people like or prefer to sort of, I guess, symbolize all of this as just representative of the Jews being slaughtered like bugs. But I see it quite differently. I see there's actual many reasons to believe that this was a literal resurrection in some spiritual sense, somewhere, somehow, I don't know. But I think the Bible is very clear on it. And the fact that these ones would no longer marry, they would be like angels in heaven, they wouldn't die anymore. Paul telling the Corinthians that the time was short, so live, if they were married, live as though they weren't, because the time was short. Peter saying the end of all things is at hand. All these warnings really kind of play in nicely, and we see here that Daniel is told that he would rise to his inheritance at the end, which is the time that was just spoken of, which I see that's the point where the faithful receive their promise. But the point I really just wanted to kind of hammer in on is the fact that, number one, this entire prophecy here about the end is related to what? It's related to the inheritance, right? It's related to the resurrection, the judgment, and the inheritance of the promise, the kingdom. And notice that nobody else is in there except for your people, Daniel. Your people. All right? And like I said, back in the time of Daniel, there was no such concept of spiritual Israelites. All right? John Hagee, Benny Hinn, John MacArthur, Don Preston, none of these guys were around back then. So your people literally meant your people. So if that promise was literally meant to your people, Daniel, and if the resurrection only involved your people, Daniel, and if the promise only involved your people, Daniel, then it makes sense of places like Acts 2 where Peter tells them, the promise is to you, Israel, to your children, Israel, and to all of you, scattered Israel, who are afar off, as many as our Lord will call. So I wanted to make sure you understood that, and I also wanted to really hammer home the point about that great multitude from all nations, which cannot in any way, shape, or form be pushed out into our day today. Because as a preterist, as a futurist, you can run down the street in your boxer shorts screaming, the Lord is at hand, and nobody would think twice, because that's just what they do. But as a consistent preterist who takes time statements very, very literally and honors them, okay? You need to understand this in light of what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse about that time of trouble, that Great Tribulation. He clearly encapsulates it in that last days generation. Like Peter said, save yourself from this perverse generation. All right, so this was all about that last days generation, and the Great Tribulation that they would go through was sort of a collective, I don't know, designation or collective describing of the persecution and the trials and the tribulations that these saints, wherever they were and wherever they would go, were going to go through in those last days leading up to the grand inheritance of their promise. So when we get to Revelation 7 and we see that great multitude from all the nations, we know that that cannot extend any further than the coming, because that's when it all wrapped up. And that's when the Great Tribulation ended. In order for us to be part of that Revelation great multitude, we would have to also admit that we personally came out from the Great Tribulation that Jesus said would take place in that last days generation. And so, of course, we know that these ones in Revelation 7, the great multitude from all nations, ties in with what Jesus said in Matthew 24:14, that the gospel would, quote, go to all nations, and then the end would come. So there it is. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. It all wraps up at the coming. And they go home to be with Papa God. And I think I'm going to go order some Papa John's. Anyways, I thank you all for listening to this quick rant. Hopefully it came out okay over the engine. I had my hand on the phone because I was reading a little portion of Daniel here, so I wonder if that muffled up. And I also got a phone call in the midst of it. So most likely this audio will suck. But I hope that the content serves you well. Thanks again, everybody. I hope you all have a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.